What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Surprising facts about Johann Sebastian Bach. The Brandenburg Concertos. The Goldberg Variations. Toccata and Fugue in D minor. When you consider his body of work, there's no denying that composer Johann Sebastian Bach was one of the towering musicians of the Baroque period. But he was also more than a little eccentric. Delve into his biography, and odd facts about Bach pop up. His now beloved Brandenburg Concertos, for instance, were written to try to win over a potential patron, and they failed. Bach's personal life was quite colorful too. He fathered 20 children, several of whom were notable composers in their own right, and was blinded by a quack doctor. Bach's legacy continues to reverberate throughout the classical music world. So it's surprising to note that his music was not well known during his lifetime, and that it virtually disappeared after his death. It would take almost 80 years for Bach's work to be resurrected beyond a small circle of admirers, ensuring his status as one of the greatest composers of all time. In his case, an unconventional life and greatness went hand in hand. He was an orphan by the age of 10. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in Eisenach, Germany on March 31, 1685. His father, also named Johann, was a seventh-generation musician who taught his son musical fundamentals. Bach's mother died in 1694, and Johann's father died 8 months later, leaving the child an orphan before the age of 10. Bach, the youngest of 8 children, was taken in by his eldest brother. He fathered 20 children. Bach had 2 wives. His first, Maria Barbara, was his second cousin, and she died in 1720. The couple had 7 children together, though only 4 lived to adulthood. Maria features in an amusing anecdote in Bach's life. In 1706, he was reprimanded by authorities for bringing a strange maiden into a church organ loft to make music. It was likely Maria. Bach's second wife, Anna Magdalena, gave birth to 13 children. 6 survived. Anna transcribed many of Bach's pieces, and was a singer and musician herself. The notebook for Anna Magdalena Bach is one of several works that Bach devoted to her. He and Handel were blinded by the same quack. Late in life, Bach's eyesight was failing. He decided to consult with a supposed expert, an oculist named John Taylor. Taylor operated on Bach in the spring of 1750. Not only did the operation fail to restore Bach's eyesight, he went into a rapid decline and died of a stroke on July 28, 1750. His death was believed to be caused by a post-operative infection. The same doctor performed cataract surgery on composer George Friedrich Handel around the same time. This operation caused Handel to go totally blind by 1752. The Brandenburg Concertos were a failed audition. One of Bach's most famous compositions is a series of 6 suites known collectively as the Brandenburg Concertos, but they were almost a side note in his career. In 1720, Bach sensed that his position at court at Cothen was in jeopardy. The new wife of his employer, Prince Leopold, was apparently not a fan of his music. But he had recently met Christian Ludwig, Margrave of Brandenburg, and thought he might be persuaded to give him a job. Bach collected together some previously composed material and sent it to Christian Ludwig, presumably to show him what he could do. Unfortunately, Ludwig never responded. He was imprisoned for a month for attempting to quit his job. Musicians like Johann Sebastian Bach were frequently employed by the nobility and rarely received much respect. Beginning in 1708, Bach worked for the Duke of Saxon-Weimar, William Ernst, as an organist and then orchestra leader. When the court's Kapellmeister, head music maker, died in 1716, Bach requested and expected to be promoted into this position. Unfortunately, the Duke appointed the deceased Kapellmeister's son instead. In disgust, Bach requested that he be dismissed, a demand that infuriated William Ernst. He had Bach tossed into jail for a month before his resignation was accepted. True to his creative nature, Bach didn't waste his time behind bars. He used that stretch to compose a cycle of organ chorale preludes. He never left Germany. After Bach's death, His music slipped into initial obscurity. One major factor in this decline in interest was Bach's residence in a relatively remote and unsophisticated part of Germany. Bach spent the last 27 years of his life in Leipzig, and he had previously lived and worked in other, smaller cities and towns in the Saxony region. Bach also never traveled to the cultural hotspots of Prague, Vienna, London or Paris. In fact, he lived and died in a 150-square-mile area and never left Germany. He was underpaid. Bach was relatively poor throughout his life. With the death of his parents at a young age, it was only his musical talent that allowed for a scholarship at a German monastery in 1700. Later, Bach and his family lived on the modest salary that he earned in various obscure German courts, where musicians were paid even less than they were in more populated areas. Unlike Mozart, Beethoven or Handel, he didn't earn money performing before large audiences. By 1730, Bach held several positions within schools or churches, but still frequently complained about his small income. His music was revived by Felix Mendelssohn. 4 years after his death, none of Bach's music was published and it was rarely performed. He was considered a dated composer and fell into obscurity. In 1823, composer Felix Mendelssohn's grandmother gave him an original manuscript of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. He decided to perform it, and presented it in concert on March 11, 1829 in Berlin. It was the first public presentation of the work in close to 100 years. The response set off a revival that catapulted Bach back into international prominence as one of classical music's most respected composers. His lost manuscripts made up a major restitution. In 1943, Berlin's Singakademie musical manuscript collection, consisting of thousands of original scores written by Bach and other members of his family, was moved from Berlin to Silesia to protect it from aerial bombardment and destruction. Eventually, it fell into the hands of the Russian army and ultimately into the possession of the KGB. The collection was stashed in a state archive in Kiev, but Soviet officials repeatedly denied its existence until 1999, when Ukrainian officials acknowledged possession. In 2002, Ukraine returned the entire 5,100 manuscript collection. It was a significant act of restitution. He might not actually be in his grave. Bach was buried in Leipzig, where he spent the last 3 decades of his life. He stayed in an unmarked location until 1894, when a search began for the remains of the now widely celebrated composer. Relying on the fact that Bach was buried in an oak casket, experts unearthed what they thought was Bach's skeleton and placed it in a vault beneath the altar of nearby St. John's Church. The saga of Bach's body doesn't end there. John's Church was badly damaged during World War II, and Bach's intact stone sarcophagus was transferred to Leipzig's Thomaskirche on the 200th anniversary of his death in 1950. Scholars have debated whether it is really Bach who is entombed within this memorial, though church officials have rejected attempts to test the DNA of the bones under the floor of the cathedral. His music is used to ease tension in airports. Baroque music crops up in some unexpected places. At LaGuardia, Newark and JFK International Airports, a classical soundtrack prominently featuring Bach is played in the vicinity of the check-in zone. His work is also regularly played in Penn Station's main mezzanine area, and many stations on the London Underground feature him too. Baroque music supposedly has a calming effect on harried travelers. Bach's benefits might extend beyond stress relief. Shopping centers and convenience store managers occasionally use Baroque music to discourage loitering. When one thinks of the titans of Western classical music, few names stand as tall as Johann Sebastian Bach, the Baroque master whose fingerprints are indelibly etched across centuries of musical development, and yet, beyond the thunderous majesty of the Brandenburg concertos, the serene beauty of the Goldberg variations, and the ominous intensity of toccata and fugue in D minor, lies a figure whose life story is riddled with ironies, oddities, and improbable twists that defy the dignified image often associated with classical composers. For instance, it is a curious and rather ironic fact that Bach's now iconic Brandenburg concertos, among his most revered creations, were actually written as a sort of desperate job application, an audition portfolio hastily assembled and sent to Christian Ludwig, Margrave of Brandenburg. In 1721, after Bach's position at the court of Cothen began to seem unstable due to political shifts and the disinterest of a musically indifferent new duchess. Yet these 6 concerti, which today are standard-bearers of Baroque orchestration, went ignored by the Margrave, never performed during Bach's lifetime and left to languish in obscurity until rediscovered nearly a century later, which underscores one of the central ironies of Bach's career. Despite being arguably the most important composer in the Baroque tradition and a foundational influence on the trajectory of Western music, he lived a life of provincial isolation, modest means, and frequent professional frustration, and at the time of his death in 1750, his reputation was largely confined to a circle of students and admirers who respected his technical mastery, especially in keyboard and counterpoint, while the broader European music scene increasingly favored more gallant, modern styles embodied by composers like his own sons, Carl Philipp Emanuel and Johann Christian, who, ironically, enjoyed greater fame during their lifetimes than their father ever did. What's even more surprising is the sheer personal intensity of the man. Born in Eisenach, Germany, on March 31, 1685, into a sprawling family of musicians that had maintained the trade across at least 7 generations, Bach was dealt a hard hand early on when his mother died in 1694 and his father passed away just 8 months later, rendering him an orphan at the age of 10 and forcing him to move in with his eldest brother, Johann Christoph, an organist in Ohrdruf, who provided him with early musical instruction, though not without some drama, such as the well-known incident where young Johann Sebastian, desperate to access forbidden music locked away by his brother, supposedly copied entire works by moonlight until he was caught and punished, a youthful act of defiance that nevertheless foreshadowed the tireless devotion to craft that would define his entire life. That devotion was deeply personal as well as professional, evidenced by the sheer number of children he fathered, 20 in total. From 2 marriages with his first wife Maria Barbara, who was also his second cousin, bearing him 7 children before her sudden death in 1720, and his second wife, the singer and scribe Anna Magdalena Wilke, bearing 13 more, though tragically only 10 of his children survived to adulthood, and while most faded into relative anonymity, several, including the aforementioned Carl Philipp Emanuel and Johann Christian, went on to achieve musical acclaim in their own right, yet perhaps none matched the legacy of their father, whose own end was marked by strange and rather tragic circumstances, as failing eyesight led him to the services of the notorious English eye surgeon John Taylor, a self-promoting oculist, who performed 2 cataract operations on Bach in early 1750, both of which were unsuccessful and likely contributed to the composer's death later that year from complications, possibly a post-operative infection. And in a dark twist of fate, Taylor would go on to blind. Another great composer, George Friedrich Handel, cementing his place in history as a man whose surgical talents brought ruin rather than relief to 2 musical giants. But Bach's professional hardships were not limited to poor medical judgment. His career was often marred by conflict with employers and frustrating hierarchies, such as the incident in 1717 when, after being denied a promotion at the court of Weimar, he asked to be released from his contract only to be thrown into prison by Duke Wilhelm Ernst for nearly a month, a punitive measure that didn't seem to faze Bach much, as he used the time to compose a series of organ chorales, a testament to his indomitable creative drive and refusal to let even incarceration hinder his output. And this stubbornness would continue to define him throughout his career, including his decision to remain in Germany for his entire life, never venturing beyond the bounds of a roughly 150 square mile area in the Saxony region, which is remarkable considering the vast cultural exchanges occurring across Europe at the time, with composers like Handel enjoying international careers that took them to London, Italy, and beyond, while Bach remained bound to local churches, small-town courts, and the modest city of Leipzig, where he spent the last 27 years of his life as cantor at the St. Thomas Church, composing much of his sacred choral music under rigid and often thankless circumstances, frequently complaining about his low salary and the uncooperative behavior of school officials and city councils. Frustrations that perhaps made him all the more prolific, as though sheer volume and precision of composition were his means of asserting control in a world that otherwise gave him little respect. It is equally astonishing to realize that after his death, Bach's music virtually vanished from the public sphere, considered too academic or old-fashioned by the standards of the classical era, and had it not been for the revival efforts led by Felix Mendelssohn, who, in 1829, conducted a landmark performance of Bach's long-neglected St. Matthew Passion in Berlin after receiving a manuscript from his grandmother, the name Bach might have remained a historical footnote rather than a cornerstone of Western music education, yet that revival did more than just restore his name. It sparked a century of rediscovery during which lost works were published, transcribed, and celebrated anew, and it eventually culminated in the dramatic restitution of a trove of original manuscripts thought lost during World War II, which had been hidden by the Sing Academy in Silesia to avoid Allied bombings, only to fall into Soviet hands and remain hidden in Kiev under KGB supervision until 1999, when Ukrainian officials finally admitted to possessing the vast 5,100 document collection, which was subsequently returned to Germany in 2002 in one of the most significant cultural restitutions of modern times. And yet, for all this posthumous glory, mysteries still swirl around the physical remains of the composer himself, for while Bach was originally buried in an unmarked grave at St. John's Church in Leipzig, his supposed remains were exhumed and relocated in 1894 based on circumstantial evidence, including the fact that the body was found in an oak coffin. But some scholars have long doubted whether the bones interred beneath the altar at the Thomaskirche truly belonged to the master, with requests for DNA testing routinely denied by church officials, thus adding yet another layer of uncertainty and mystique to a life already filled with so many contradictions and curiosities. And as if that weren't enough, consider the modern uses of Bach's music in the most unexpected places. From soothing stressed travelers in the bustling terminals of LaGuardia and Heathrow, to calming rowdy crowds at Penn Station, to even deterring loitering in retail settings, Baroque music, especially the clear, mathematical structures of Bach's fugues, has been embraced not just for its aesthetic brilliance but for its psychoacoustic properties, its ability to soothe, regulate, or in some cases, dissuade antisocial behavior, an application that Bach himself could never have anticipated when penning his compositions on the floors of cold German churches or in cramped studies lit by candlelight, and while he may have never earned the financial or social rewards of his more cosmopolitan peers, his posthumous reach has become something far greater than fame. It is a testament to the enduring power of form, structure, emotion, and devotion to craft, elements that continue to resonate, not only in symphony halls and classrooms but in airports, train stations, and shopping centers around the world, where the spirit of Bach lives on in polyphonic whispers, reminding us that greatness is not always recognized in its own time, and that sometimes the most astonishing thing about a genius is not merely what he created, but how he persevered against all odds to create it at all. Who was Amelia Earhart? She was a flight pioneer, an author, a fashion designer, and many other things. Earhart was born in Kansas in 1897. She was the oldest of two daughters, and her mother didn't believe in raising her children to be proper and dainty little girls. Instead, they wore bloomers, pants, and had plenty of freedom to explore and do what they wanted. From the beginning, Earhart was a tomboy. She spent her free time climbing trees and sledding down hills. All of this set the scene for what came later, when she broke through the traditional wall of male-dominated aviation. Like other badass women who make history, the life of Amelia Earhart was all about breaking the rules and setting her own records. By pursuing her dreams, she made history. She literally rode sleds off of a roof as a little girl. On a trip to Louis as a child, Earhart saw her first roller coaster, and she was immediately intrigued. To satisfy her craving for the height and speed of the wooden contraption, in 1904, she and her uncle built a roller coaster-like ramp and attached it to the roof of her family's shed. Earhart fearlessly went on her ramp's maiden voyage in a wooden box. She wound up with a torn dress and a bruised lip, but declared the experience to be just like flying. She went hard for women's rights. The Equal Rights Amendment, the proposed amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee women equal rights that never actually got passed, first started getting kicked around in the early 1920s, and was officially presented to Congress in 1923. Amelia Earhart Bloomer-Warren Baddis was one of its first and most ardent supporters. Earhart was also a vocal member of the National Women's Party, which was created to get women the right to vote. She somehow survived the unsurvivable. In 1918, the United States was ravaged by the Spanish flu. In fact, it's considered one of the deadliest natural disasters of all time. Over 500 million people were infected worldwide, and an estimated 100 million of them were killed, most of them healthy adults without any previous medical problems. Some who survived were plagued by sinus problems, which is true of Earhart. However, she didn't let that stop her, and she wasn't felled by the flu either. Although it did take her a year to recuperate, your girl came out on top. Through her work as a truck driver, she paid for her own depravity. Earhart and her father went to a Long Beach, California airfield in 1920. There, she experienced something that would change her life. A flight with a pilot named Frank Hawks. Earhart reflected on her first foray away from Earth, claiming, "By the time I had got 200 or 300 feet off the ground, I knew I had to fly." She was determined to learn how to fly an airplane on her own, come hell or high water. So, in order to afford the lessons, Earhart worked as a truck driver, a stenographer, and a photographer. She flew across entire oceans totally alone. Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean on May 20, 1932. To accomplish this feat, she flew 14 hours straight from Newfoundland to Ireland. Her intended destination, which was actually Paris, France, was changed to something closer due to icy weather. However, badasses who make history like Earhart never rest on their laurels. So, one-upping herself, she later became the first person to fly across both the Atlantic and Pacific. She was a record-setting machine. Amelia Earhart was not afraid to set an aeronautical record, and she didn't just go for the ones set by other women either. On top of her many ridiculous accomplishments, such as flying solo across the Atlantic Ocean, Earhart set the women's autogyro altitude record, was the first person, not just the first woman, to fly solo from Honolulu, Hawaii to Oakland, California, was the person to fly solo from Los Angeles to Mexico City, and set 7 women's speed and distance aviation records. It's no wonder she attempted to circle the globe as her final feat of daring. She was damn good at what she did.